Spooky time with r/LetsNotMeet. Posted by u/spa charity. A girl called Laura. When I was 10 years old, I lived in a relatively small town in Texas in a small house with my mom. My mom has always had a very caring heart for those in need. So when my uncle called her one night and told her he ran into a homeless girl at the local park, my mom offered to help her out for a day or so just to get her back on her feet. That sort of thing. When the girl arrived at my house, she said her name was Laura. Laura told us she was 16 at the time. She seemed like a shy girl. When my mother asked what she was doing out on the streets, Laura told us she had been kicked out of her home by her mom because her mom had accused her of sleeping with her boyfriend. Laura told us that allegation wasn't true. She told us her mother's boyfriend was the one who came onto her. My mom gave Laura a place to sleep in the guest bedroom that night. The next day, after breakfast, Laura asked to use my mom's house phone to call her mom to see if she could get some of her things from her mom's house. Laura's mom never answered the phone and we felt bad for her. As a 10-year-old girl, I couldn't imagine what she must have been going through. Later that day, I remember watching TV in the living room and minding my own business. But I could feel someone staring at me, so I turned my head where I felt the gaze. Laura has sending me a glare so cold that if looks could kill, I would have dropped dead. I was confused and a little startled. I turned my head away from her quickly and went back to watching TV, but I could still feel Laura's cold gaze. I couldn't understand what I had done to her to cause her to look at me with such hate. The next day, it happened once more. I was in the kitchen getting a glass of water when I could feel someone looking at me. I turned my head to the side and saw Laura's head peering around the corner at me. Her eyes were dark and laced with hatred. It frightened me and I felt so confused as to why she was looking at me like this. I didn't want to cause any trouble, so I didn't bring up Laura's death glares to my mother at all. Later that night, my uncle had joined us for dinner. He had stopped by to see how everything was with Laura and if we had any luck finding her a place to live with one of her family members. After dinner, I was washing my plate in the sink when I heard a loud growling sound come from the dining room. I turned my head to see Laura shaking and growling like some sort of wild animal. My mom and uncle looked disturbed and worried. Laura threw herself onto the floor and began thrashing around and screaming as if she were possessed. I was absolutely terrified. It was a scary thing to witness. I grew up very religious. My mom and uncle began praying out loud for Laura while I ran to my room and closed the door. This went on for 2 hours, but it felt like an eternity of horror. I could hear Laura screaming like a mad woman and growling like some sort of deranged beast. I don't think any of us knew exactly what was going on. After my mom and uncle had prayed for Laura for what felt like forever, Laura told us she was free from an evil demon that had taken over her. None of us were sure what had caused her behavior. None of us were sure what had even happened. I peeked my head out of my room to see Laura smiling happily while she curled up on the couch with a blanket. Her eyes opened and she shot a cold glare at me. I quickly closed my bedroom door in fear. I placed a chair in front of my bedroom door and went to sleep. I woke up the next morning by my mom waking me up. She told me that she was taking me out to eat at my favorite restaurant. When I asked her if Laura was going, she gave me a serious expression and spoke. "Your uncle is going to take Laura back to her mom's house. He slept on the couch last night after what happened. He and I were talking when the two of you had gone to sleep and we pieced together that Laura made the entire performance up last night. She said, she is not stable and we think she's dangerous." As I heard my mother say those words, relief washed over me. I got dressed and went to the car to go to the restaurant with my mom. When we got into the car, we saw Laura and my uncle getting in his truck with her. Laura looked angry. Her expression was of a child's when you don't give them what they want. She got into my uncle's car and they drove away. I'm 22 now and I have never forgotten about this horrific incident that happened in my life years ago. After that day, I never saw Laura or heard anything else about her ever again. Posted by you/nowayros3. I'll always regret never telling. Firstly, I must start at the beginning. Ever since I was a little girl I have only ever had one family member whom would ever truly listen to me. The others were there purely for discipline and enforcing education. No emotional support, there was never any time for that. The reason I am telling you this is because it may help some readers understand my reaction a bit better. When I was in my early teens I moved to a new country with my mother as she had found a husband via a mail order bride type of website. Nonetheless, I was in a new country where I didn't know how to speak the language, English. I had no friends or family aside from my mother and new stepfather. I started high school and had an extremely hard time adapting to everything, including home life. I was a foreigner even in my own room, it felt like. After a while I did start to make some new friends, some of which liked to smoke a lot of weed in between and after classes and I would occasionally join. On one particular day I decided to stay behind after PE and meet my friend Tristan at the back of the basketball courts to smoke a couple of doobies before going home. We blaze up, listen to music, chat and even have a little flirt before giving each other a hug goodbye. Tristan and I lived on opposite sides of the basketball court so he turned left and I turned right. It's important to note that by this time it was very dark outside aside from the occasional street light. I had passed the school and was about to reach the end of the car park when I noticed that two older guys, maybe in their 20s, stepped out of the car and one of them approached me asking for a cigarette. I didn't have one so I said sorry, engaged in small chat and went to continue on my way when I felt the whole back and top of my waist-length hair being yanked back so hard that I immediately hit the ground. The guy that had just asked me for a smoke was now on top of my chalking me and screaming in my face. I still to this day cannot remember what he was saying. I think I just deleted that out of my brain. The other guy was still standing by the car, just watching. I start to struggle and wriggle myself loose enough to try to crawl away but felt a blow to the back of my head and lights out. I start regaining consciousness when I felt dirt hitting my face and chest. Still laying there with my eyes closed and playing dead, I realized that I'm in the process of being buried. It was all such a blur from here but before I could even think of a plan to save my ass I hear one of them yell out, "Fuck this man, we have to go." The lights went on. Everything went silent and slowly opened my eyes, checking to see if the coast was clear and it was. I was all alone, covered head to toe in dirt from a ridiculous shallow grave that was attempted to be made for me in a ditch behind the parking lot. Looking back, the part that freaks me out the most is that I felt so insignificant that I snuck into my bedroom, cleaned myself and my clothes up before the morning and never spoke to anyone about it. The next day I realized that the light they were referring to is the big, bright lights that come on every evening over the basketball and tennis courts for private lessons. Big bright lights that probably saved my life. Posted by you/Oniranaut369. To the man who followed me home from school when I was 9. I lived in an alright area, the distance between my school and home wasn't too far so my mum never minded us walking home alone. I left school a little bit late one day, probably around 4, not that much later but it was winter so it was starting to get dark. I noticed a strange man walking behind me and thought nothing of it, so I carried on walking until I felt uncomfortable because he had gotten closer. I decided to take a shortcut thinking there would be no way he would be going that way. He followed me up the path and through the shortcut. Now freaking out I decided to start jogging, trying not to make it obvious, but he started speeding up and almost jogging too. I was small so my jogging was probably his speed walking. I got close to home and ran up my path to turn into my garden. I then turned around to see that he had followed me up the path until he saw me reach my garden. He literally just turned around and walked back the other way. I don't know what his intentions were, nor do I want to know, but I ran in the house and straight upstairs to my bedroom and just started crying. 10-15 minutes later my mum came up and asked me what was wrong. I told her and she asked why I hadn't come straight to her when I came in. That was the last time I wanted to walk home from school. So to the guy who followed me home when I was 9, now 18, let's not meet.